A black executive steps off a red-eye flight, exhausted but relieved to finally return home after weeks of business travel. As she crosses the terminal, briefcase in hand, her focus is on calling a ride and getting to her family. But just as she nears the exit, a security officer steps in front of her. His eyes linger a little too long on her carry-on, his questions sharper than necessary. Without cause, he asks her to step aside for additional screening. Passengers stream by, casting quick glances but saying nothing. As the minutes pass, her frustration simmers beneath the surface. But she keeps calm because she knows this isn't the first time. And it won't be the last. 7 minutes later, the officer waves her on without apology. But the damage is done. What happens next, however, takes everyone by surprise. In less than 24 hours, a viral post, a single photo, and a statement from her company expose not just this moment, but the quiet injustices many face daily. The response? It sets off a wave of accountability no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. If stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. The airport, like so many other places, carried the quiet hum of unspoken rules. They hovered just beneath the surface, invisible to the untrained eye but felt by those who had long since learned to recognize them. Naomi Carter had learned. She had learned young. As she moved through the terminal, the crowd parted for her not by intention but by instinct. Naomi was not loud, nor did she demand attention. Her power lay in the absence of apology, the quiet certainty of her steps. Her suit, pressed and perfect, was the shade of cool slate. It said nothing, yet it whispered everything. The gate agent, a young man in his 20s with a crisp uniform and unsure eyes, straightened when he saw her approaching. His greeting was polite but guarded. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Carter." Naomi smiled, a small, polite thing that neither invited nor rejected. "Thank you," she replied, her voice even, steady. The gate agent's eyes flickered to the seat assignment printed on her boarding pass. And for the briefest moment, there it was, the pause. It was the kind of pause Naomi had met 1,000 times before. A flicker of hesitation, the smallest of signals, so subtle that even the gate agent himself may not have noticed it. But Naomi did. She always did. She walked down the jet bridge, her heels tapping lightly against the floor, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Inside the cabin, Lena Foster moved with the precision of someone who had memorized every inch of the aircraft. She was efficient, meticulous, and proud of the work she did. Lena liked to believe she was fair, prided herself on treating everyone the same, no matter their seat or status. But fairness, Naomi knew, was often shaped by who was on the receiving end. Naomi stepped into the first-class cabin, scanning the rows with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to these spaces. She placed her briefcase neatly at her feet and settled into seat 2A. Lena noticed her immediately. It wasn't that Naomi had done anything unusual, but there was something Lena couldn't quite name that made her glance again. Naomi's composure, the absence of uncertainty, seemed to pull at the edges of Lena's professional mask. Passengers were still trickling in when Lena approached her. Clipboard in hand, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to seem professional but firm. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lena said, scanning the seat assignment. "I just need to confirm your ticket." Naomi met her eyes, unbothered, and reached into her bag. Of course. Lena took the ticket, her eyes narrowing as she inspected the glossy print. Her brow furrowed, though there was nothing unusual about it. First class, seat 2A, everything in order. But it wasn't enough. "This is a first-class ticket," Lena said, as if to herself, as if Naomi hadn't already known. "Yes," Naomi replied, her tone light, yet unmoving. Lena hesitated. A small crease formed between her brows. She glanced over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear and validate her unspoken concerns. "Are you sure this is your assigned seat?" Lena pressed, her voice soft but edged with something sharper now. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "I'm sure." There was a pause, brief but heavy, as if the two women stood at opposite ends of a line neither could cross. "I'll have to check with the desk," Lena said, though Naomi knew she wouldn't. Naomi nodded, unbothered, and resumed her reading, but the weight of the exchange lingered. Lena returned to the galley, gripping the edge of the counter tighter than she needed to. She glanced toward Rebecca, the head flight attendant, whose years of experience allowed her to catch things others missed. "There's a passenger in 2A, Lena said quietly. "She might have. Is her ticket valid?" Rebecca cut in without looking up. "Yes, but then there's no issue," Rebecca replied firmly, and that was the end of it. Lena said nothing more, but the unease remained. As the flight continued to board, Lena couldn't stop glancing toward Naomi, watching as she sat quietly, reading as though the cabin wasn't pulsing with unspoken questions. Naomi felt the eyes. She always did, the weight of being seen, and yet unseen. The contradiction was exhausting, but never surprising. By the time the flight took off, Naomi knew the day's performance had only just begun. The plane had not yet left the ground, but Naomi Carter could feel the altitude rising. It wasn't the familiar hum of the engines or the distant crackle of the pilot's voice over the intercom. No, this was something older, something quieter. Lena Foster moved through the cabin with the polite urgency that all flight attendants mastered, quick but not rushed. Warm but distant, she distributed drinks to the other passengers, laughing softly at the right moments, leaning in when necessary. But no matter how often she circled first class, her eyes always drifted back to 2A. Naomi felt the glances. They were small things, passing by like shadows that didn't linger but left the air a little colder. Naomi had lived too long to mistake them for anything else. The other passengers in first class were beginning to settle, men in tailored suits tapping furiously at laptops, women adjusting silk scarves and exchanging polite nods. Yet the seat beside Naomi remained empty. The absence felt larger than it should have. Lena approached again, this time without the clipboard. There was no ticket to check, no technicality to hide behind. "Can I get you something to drink?" Lena's voice carried the same practiced tone, but the edges were rougher now, less polished. Naomi smiled, but not because she was amused. She recognized this moment the narrowing of space, the softening of language that suggested something else entirely. "Water's fine," Naomi replied, folding her hands over the edge of her tray table. Her voice was smooth, even, but in the brief pause between her words, there was enough weight to remind Lena that she wasn't asking for permission. Lena nodded, but Naomi saw the flicker of something else: frustration, confusion, maybe even disbelief. As Lena walked back to the galley, her steps clipped and brisk. Naomi returned to her reading, but the words on the page, sharp and deliberate, began to blur. She remembered this theater, this play. The script had been handed down for generations, and Naomi had memorized every line. It starts with a seat. A seat, after all, is never just a seat. It is an unspoken declaration, a silent assertion of belonging. In this cabin, the seats were more than leather and metal, they were symbols. And for some people, like Naomi, a seat in first class meant a little more. It was not just comfort or luxury. It was a statement. I am here. I deserve to be here. But even when the ticket says 2A, there are those who look for another kind of proof. Rebecca, the head flight attendant, appeared in the aisle, her eyes skimming the cabin like a captain surveying her ship. She moved with the calm assurance of someone who had seen it all before. But when she passed by Naomi's row, she paused just long enough for Naomi to notice. "Good afternoon, Ms. Carter," Rebecca said, her tone soft but deliberate. Naomi met her gaze. "Good afternoon." It was a brief exchange, but Lena, watching from the galley, caught it, her brow furrowed as she leaned toward Emily, the younger flight attendant assisting with preparations in the back. "Did you see that?" Lena asked, keeping her voice low, Emily glanced up from the tray of drinks she was arranging. See what? Rebecca. She knows her. Emily shrugged. She knows a lot of passengers. Lena wasn't convinced. Not like that. It's different. Emily smiled faintly, not bothering to look up this time. Maybe she's important. The words hung there, casual and light, but Lena heard them louder than Emily had likely intended. Important. Lena lingered in the galley, her thoughts circling like crows over a battlefield. Naomi, meanwhile, turned the page of her book but found herself staring out the window instead. She had never needed anyone to explain the rules. They were written in the spaces between looks. In the polite smiles stretched just a little too thin. In the way hands hovered a second too long over a clipboard. The turbulence of being questioned, of being asked to prove again and again what was already clear, had followed Naomi for years. But first class had its own gravity. And no matter how calm the flight, Naomi knew there were some people who could never quite believe she belonged there. She exhaled slowly, watching as Lena returned to the cabin. Naomi could feel it coming, the next act. It always comes back to the seat. Naomi glanced down at the unoccupied chair beside her. Even empty, it seemed to echo with something unsaid. The hum of the plane was steady, but beneath it, something quieter stirred. Naomi Carter felt it growing, subtle as a rising tide. It had been years since she last felt the need to brace herself for this particular dance. But the steps had not changed. Lena Foster re-emerged from the galley, this time without pretense. There were no drinks in her hands, no passenger requests to attend to. She walked with the careful stride of someone approaching a question they were still unsure how to ask. Naomi, eyes still on the book she had long since stopped reading, heard the footsteps slow near her row. Excuse me, ma'am. Naomi didn't look up immediately. She let the pause stretch out, as if to see if Lena would find the courage to fill the silence herself. When it became clear she wouldn't, Naomi lifted her gaze. Lena's expression was measured, but Naomi could see the faint tension at the corners of her mouth, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. I just need to confirm something with you, Lena said, her voice lighter than necessary, as though by softening her tone, the nature of the intrusion would somehow lessen. Naomi placed her bookmark carefully between the pages, closing the book with deliberate calm. Is there a problem? Lena hesitated for just a breath too long. It's just, I noticed that seat 2B is unoccupied. Naomi raised an eyebrow. It is. Well, Lena shifted her weight, glancing briefly down the aisle. Sometimes passengers in economy will, by mistake, sit up front during boarding. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order. Naomi studied her carefully. She could see Lena's discomfort, the need to rationalize the unspoken. And you thought I was mistaken? Naomi's voice was even, but there was no mistaking the gravity behind it. Lena opened her mouth to respond, but Naomi continued before she could find the words. I've been sitting in this seat since I boarded. I presented my ticket to you, which you verified twice. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. What exactly is out of order? Lena's lips parted slightly, but no answer came. The silence that followed wasn't the quiet comfort shared between equals. It was the heavy weight of something unsaid, something both women understood far too well. Finally, Lena straightened, smoothing invisible creases from her uniform. I just wanted to be sure. That's all, she said, her tone less confident now. Naomi gave a small nod. I see. She reopened her book, but the moment lingered between them like an unfinished sentence. Lena walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, her steps sharp, as though trying to outrun her own discomfort. She passed Rebecca near the cockpit. Everything all right? Rebecca asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched Lena's posture. Lena hesitated, then shrugged. I'm not sure. Rebecca's gaze flicked down the aisle, landing briefly on Naomi. She's not causing any trouble. I didn't say she was, Lena replied, perhaps a bit too quickly. Rebecca leveled her with a look. You don't have to. Lena crossed her arms, lowering her voice. I don't get it, Rebecca. There's something about her. She's so calm, like she's waiting for something. Rebecca's expression softened into something that resembled pity. Maybe she's not waiting. Maybe she's used to this. Lena frowned, unsure what to make of that. Leave her alone, Rebecca said, her voice firm. She's in her seat. She paid for it. You're seeing ghosts. Lena nodded, but the knot in her stomach remained. Naomi turned the page of her book, though the words felt distant now. She caught fragments of the hushed conversation up front. She didn't need to hear the details to know the shape of it. It was an old shape, one that bent and curved but never broke. The truth, Naomi knew, was that this seat wasn't the problem. The problem was her sitting in it. She thought back to the countless flights before this one, to the moments when her presence had been questioned, sometimes with subtle glances, other times with outright confrontation. The weight of it was exhausting in ways she could never fully explain. But she had long ago decided that she would not carry the burden of making others comfortable. She glanced around the cabin at the other passengers, most of whom seemed blissfully unaware of the quiet storm that had just passed through. An older man across the aisle caught her eye briefly, offering a polite nod before returning to his newspaper. Perhaps he had seen it too. Naomi exhaled softly, pressing her back into the leather seat. Let them wonder. Let them ask questions. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The seatbelt sign flickered off with a soft chime, but Naomi Carter knew better than to think that meant the turbulence was over. She watched Lena Foster weave through the cabin, performing the ordinary rituals of flight, refilling coffee cups, tucking blankets over the knees of sleeping passengers, exchanging quiet laughs with those eager for small talk. But Naomi noticed the way Lena's eyes kept returning, like a pendulum drawn to its center. It wasn't overt. The glances never lingered long enough to cross the line into confrontation. No, Lena was too practiced for that. But Naomi had learned to measure suspicion in fractions, half a second longer here. The slight downturn of a mouth there. She turned the page of her book, but the words no longer held weight. Suspicion, Naomi knew, was heavier than the leather seat beneath her. It did not announce itself in shouts or slurs. It seeped quietly into the crevices of polite conversation, masked by the language of procedure, of protocol. And this was how it was: the mechanics of everyday racism, polished and subtle, carried out not by hatred but by habit. Naomi could feel it in the way Lena's shoulders stiffened each time she passed row 2A. As if Naomi's very presence required additional confirmation. And perhaps, Naomi thought bitterly, it did. Lena stood at the front of the cabin now, flipping through the flight manifest with forced ease. Something bothering you? Rebecca's voice cut through Lena's thoughts. Lena looked up too quickly. No, nothing. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. You're sure? Lena hesitated, casting a glance toward the back of the plane as if the answer might be hiding there. There's something off about her, Lena finally admitted, lowering her voice so the other passengers wouldn't hear. Rebecca followed her gaze to Naomi, who sat still and composed, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, the other holding her book. Off? Rebecca repeated, her tone neutral but sharp around the edges. She's too calm, Lena muttered. It's like she's waiting for me to slip up. Rebecca exhaled through her nose, as if she'd heard this before. Maybe she's calm because she's been here before, Rebecca said, leaning against the galley wall. Lena's brows knit together. I don't understand. Rebecca's eyes drifted back to Naomi. She knows the rules, Rebecca continued, and she knows you're trying to find a reason to make her an exception to them. Lena stiffened. That's not fair. I'm just doing my job. Rebecca didn't respond right away. Are you? Rebecca finally asked. Or are you just doing what feels familiar? The question hung between them like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Naomi could feel the shift. It wasn't in Lena's footsteps this time, but in the way Rebecca now watched her too, though not with suspicion. No, Rebecca's eyes held something else. Understanding. It was a quiet acknowledgement that Naomi wasn't supposed to need. But that was the trouble with being black in first class. Even if you didn't ask for the performance, it found you. Naomi returned her gaze to the window, watching clouds roll beneath the wing. Out there, the world stretched wide and open. But inside this cabin, it was small and fragile, held together by the thin thread of unspoken tension. Naomi thought of her father, who had once told her that being black in America was like walking on glass. "You can keep your head high," he had said, "but that doesn't mean they won't hear the sound of it cracking beneath your feet." She could hear it now. Lena passed by once more, and this time Naomi caught her eye, offering the faintest trace of a smile. The glass cracked a little louder. By the time the dinner service began, the tension had settled into something quieter but no less persistent. Naomi accepted her meal without complaint, though she noticed Lena's hand trembled slightly as she placed the tray down. "Thank you," Naomi said, watching Lena's reaction carefully. Lena hesitated. "Let me know if you need anything else." Naomi's smile didn't fade. "I will." As Lena turned to leave, Naomi let her eyes linger a moment longer. Long enough for Lena to feel the weight of being watched. Because sometimes, Naomi knew, the best way to remind someone of your humanity was to make them uncomfortable in their own skin. It wasn't revenge. It was just the sound of glass underfoot. Naomi Carter wasn't sure when the war began, only that she had been drafted long before she learned to name it. It wasn't the kind of war people liked to discuss. There were no rifles or parades, no grand speeches to rally the troops. No, this war was quieter. It existed in the space between questions that should not need asking and answers that were never quite enough. And now, at 30,000 feet, Naomi felt the familiar weight of it pressing down. The dinner trays had been cleared. The cabin dimmed. Passengers around her began retreating behind silk eye masks or flickering screens. But Naomi remained awake. She could feel the watchful eyes of Lena Foster, somewhere just beyond the curtain, lingering like a shadow. The performance wasn't over. It never really was. Lena appeared once more, walking the length of first class with the idle pace of someone pretending not to stare. Naomi marked her approach by the rustling of fabric, the faint creak of shoes pressed into the aisle's thin carpet. When Lena slowed beside her row, Naomi felt it before she saw it. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Naomi looked up from her book. Her expression was neutral, but the air around her tightened just slightly. "I'm fine," Naomi replied, her voice steady. Lena smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let me know if you need anything." Naomi's gaze held for a second longer than necessary. "I will." Lena nodded, hesitating just long enough to reveal what Naomi already knew: she wasn't checking on anyone else. As Lena drifted toward the galley, Naomi let out a soft breath, placing her book face down on the table. She thought of the old refrain, "They don't see you until they do. And then they see too much." Naomi was visible now, in a way she hadn't asked to be. In the galley, Lena busied herself with trivial tasks, stacking glasses and reorganizing silverware that didn't need rearranging. But her mind was elsewhere. Rebecca leaned against the opposite counter, arms crossed as she watched Lena with quiet scrutiny. "You're still circling," Rebecca said softly, not bothering to mask the disapproval in her voice. Lena didn't look up. "I'm just making sure everything's in order." Rebecca exhaled sharply, stepping forward until her presence could no longer be ignored. "She doesn't need you hovering," Rebecca said, keeping her voice low but firm. "Whatever you're hoping to find, let it go." Lena frowned. "I'm not." "You are," Rebecca interrupted. "And the thing about passengers like her, they notice." Lena's eyes flicked up, finally meeting Rebecca's. "Passengers like her?" Rebecca didn't blink. "You know what I mean." Lena straightened her shoulders, arms folding across her chest. "I'm just doing my job." Rebecca shook her head, a small, weary smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "No, Lena," she said softly, "you're doing something else, and I think you know it." Naomi's fingers traced the edges of her phone as she scrolled through unread emails. But her focus was elsewhere. She caught glimpses of movement from the galley. The faint echo of Lena's voice rising and falling in hushed tones. She didn't need to hear the words. She already understood the conversation. Naomi had learned long ago that racism didn't always announce itself with slurs or fists. Sometimes, it was the way people held their gaze a second too long. The way they asked questions that hadn't been asked of anyone else. It was, in many ways, more exhausting than outright hate because it demanded patience without ever rewarding it. Naomi glanced toward the galley just as Lena emerged. Her smile tight as she resumed her quiet patrol of the aisle. Their eyes met briefly, and Naomi felt it the expectation. There it was, the weight of needing to prove, yet again, that she belonged. Naomi took a breath and steadied herself. She had learned how to wear grace the way soldiers wore armor. A man seated across the aisle glanced toward Naomi, offering a polite nod. He was older, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen enough of the world to understand the contours of moments like these. "Long flight," he said quietly, as if the words held more than one meaning. Naomi smiled softly. "It always is." The man chuckled, folding his newspaper. "They make you work for that seat, don't they?" Naomi's eyes flicked briefly to Lena, who now stood near the curtain leading to the economy cabin. "Yes," Naomi replied simply. "They do." The man shifted in his seat, his gaze soft but knowing. "You get used to it," he said, "but it doesn't get easier." Naomi glanced down at her lap, smoothing the crease in her slacks. "I'm not sure we're supposed to get used to it," she replied, her voice low but resolute. The man nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe not." They let the silence settle between them. Not uncomfortable but full of understanding, the kind that only exists between strangers who know the same battles. As the plane cruised forward, Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engines wash over her. The war would continue long after this flight landed. But for now, Naomi let herself rest. Lena's eyes might linger, and questions might remain unasked but implied. But Naomi had learned how to win this war. Not by raising her voice but by holding her ground. And for now, holding her ground was more than enough. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane eased into its steady rhythm across the sky. Outside the window, the clouds stretched endless and unbroken. But inside, Naomi Carter felt the subtle fractures, cracks that had nothing to do with altitude or turbulence. Lena Foster hadn't passed by in a while, but Naomi could still feel her presence. Somewhere beyond the curtain separating first class from economy, Lena lingered, caught in the space between uncertainty and conviction. It was an old, familiar tension, the weight of being watched by someone who hadn't yet decided how far they were willing to go. Naomi had seen it before. She knew how it worked. Racism, when it wasn't loud, was about distance. It was about the space people put between themselves and the thing they feared, sometimes an inch, sometimes a mile, and in this case, it was the length of a narrow airplane aisle, growing longer with every second Lena stayed behind that curtain. Naomi shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting the crease in her slacks. She was too familiar with the language of silence to mistake it for peace. In the galley, Lena stood with her back against the counter, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in thought. The hum of the engines filled the space. But Rebecca's voice cut through it like a blade. "Why are you still back here?" Lena looked up, startled. She hadn't heard Rebecca approach. "I needed a minute," Lena replied, though she knew the excuse didn't hold much weight. Rebecca leaned against the opposite wall, watching her with the calm scrutiny of someone who had no patience for self-deception. "You know, the funny thing about this job," Rebecca said, her voice low but deliberate, "is that it shows you who you are whether you like it or not." Lena frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Rebecca shrugged. "It means you can hide behind professionalism all you want. But sooner or later, the way you see people slips through." Lena's jaw tightened. "I'm not treating her any differently." Rebecca's eyes sharpened. "Aren't you?" Lena opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught somewhere between her chest and throat. "She's sitting in her seat. Lena," Rebecca continued, "and you're back here, pacing like you're waiting for her to disappear." Lena bristled. "I'm just making sure everything's running smoothly." Rebecca's head tilted slightly, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Running smoothly for who?" Lena didn't answer. Rebecca pushed off the wall, brushing past Lena with the ease of someone who had nothing left to say. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the low thrum of the engines wash over her. But peace, she knew, was fleeting. She sensed movement before she saw it. The curtain shifted, and Lena stepped back into the first-class cabin. Her expression composed, but the tension still lingered in her shoulders. Naomi didn't look up immediately. She let Lena approach, feeling the weight of her presence before acknowledging it. "Can I get you anything else, Miss Carter?" Lena asked, her voice softer than before. Naomi glanced up, meeting Lena's gaze head-on. There was no hostility there, just the cool, quiet certainty of someone who had learned long ago not to blink first. "No," Naomi said simply. "I'm fine." Lena nodded, but her eyes lingered, as if searching for something she couldn't quite name. Naomi let the silence stretch between them, unbroken but heavy. Lena shifted awkwardly. "If you need anything, I'll let you know," Naomi finished for her. Lena offered a polite smile, but it faltered under Naomi's steady gaze. As Lena turned to leave, Naomi watched her walk the length of the cabin, her steps just a little too quick, as if she were retreating from something she couldn't explain. Naomi exhaled slowly, resting her head against the seat. She had learned a long time ago that belonging was not about comfort, it was about endurance. And tonight, as the clouds drifted beneath her, Naomi endured. The war wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was enough that she stayed. The night had thickened around the plane, pressing against the small oval windows like velvet. Outside, there was nothing but darkness, vast and quiet. But inside the cabin, Naomi Carter felt the familiar hum of something restless, something that had not yet found its voice. She had hoped that Lena Foster's absence meant the tension had finally eased, that perhaps the battle would dissolve into quiet surrender. But battles like these didn't end with silence. They echoed, faint but persistent, like the memory of footsteps down a long, empty hallway. Naomi's fingers hovered over the screen of her phone, but her attention drifted elsewhere, to the flicker of shadows passing along the aisle, to the low murmur of conversation near the galley. She could feel it, the slow tightening of invisible strings. It wasn't paranoia. It never was. Naomi had lived long enough to know the difference between imagination and the weight of history. Lena's absence hadn't signaled retreat. It had only been an intermission. At the front of the plane, Lena stood beside the curtain, smoothing invisible creases from her uniform. The soft glow of the cabin lights cast shadows beneath her eyes. Rebecca emerged from the galley, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. "You're still at it," Rebecca said quietly, though there was no mistaking the edge in her voice. Lena looked up, startled, though she tried to hide it. "I don't know what you mean." Rebecca's lips thinned into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You can't let it go. Can you?" Lena bristled. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Rebecca tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "That's the thing, Lena. People always say that right before they do something they can't take back." Lena stiffened, the muscles in her shoulders tightening like coiled rope. "I just want to be sure," Lena said, quieter this time, as if the words themselves felt unsure in her mouth. Rebecca leaned in, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Sure of what?" Lena glanced toward the curtain leading to first class, her gaze lingering longer than she intended. "She doesn't act like the others," Lena muttered. Rebecca's brows lifted. "The others?" Lena shifted under the weight of the question, regretting the words even as they left her lips. "She carries herself like she owns the place." Lena tried again, but the explanation felt hollow, even to her own ears. Rebecca studied her for a long moment. "And that bothers you?" Lena didn't answer. Rebecca sighed softly, shaking her head. Maybe it should bother you less that she acts like she belongs and more that you think she shouldn't. The words landed heavily between them. But Lena didn't respond. Naomi could hear the faint footsteps approaching long before Lena reappeared. The curtain whispered as it was drawn aside. And there Lena stood composed. Polite, but with the quiet tremor of someone who hadn't yet convinced herself she was in the right. Naomi didn't move, but her eyes met Lena's the moment she appeared. For a while, neither spoke. Lena shifted, clearing her throat softly. Is there anything I can get you? Naomi closed her book slowly, setting it down on the tray table with care. No, Naomi replied. I'm comfortable. Lena hesitated, as if waiting for Naomi to say more, to offer some sign of misunderstanding, something to make this easier. But Naomi didn't, because the truth was, this wasn't about misunderstanding. It never was. Lena nodded, though the gesture felt half-hearted. She lingered for a second longer, then turned and walked back toward the galley. Her footsteps quieter now, like the retreat of someone who wasn't sure if they had won or lost. Naomi watched her go, exhaling softly. She could feel the weight of it, the unfinished business that hung in the space between them. The questions left unspoken, but Naomi had no intention of answering questions she hadn't been asked. There was something exhausting about always having to explain your presence, to remind people that you belonged in spaces they had already claimed for themselves. Naomi had grown tired of that game a long time ago. Now, she simply occupied the space she had paid for and let the rest unravel as it would. By the time the plane began its slow descent, Lena had passed by Naomi's seat 3 more times. But she hadn't spoken again. Naomi felt the victory in that silence, not the kind that comes from confrontation, but the kind that settles when the weight of your existence refuses to bend. As the wheels touched the ground, Naomi fastened her seatbelt and glanced toward the window, watching as the city lights stretched out below like veins of gold threading through the darkness. It wasn't triumph she felt, only the quiet satisfaction of having held her ground, of knowing she would walk off this plane the same way she had walked onto it. Whole, unapologetic. Lena Foster, Naomi suspected, would remember this flight long after Naomi had forgotten it. And that, perhaps, was enough. The descent began as softly as a whisper, the plane lowering itself carefully into the cradle of the night. Naomi Carter watched the lights of the city flicker far below, sprawling out in quiet, steady lines. From this height, everything looked peaceful, as if the world itself had smoothed its edges. But Naomi knew better. She had learned long ago that peace was often a performance. And the closer you came to the ground, the clearer the fractures became. Lena Foster's absence had stretched long across the final hour of the flight. But Naomi could still feel the loose threads left behind. The thing about racism, Naomi thought, is that even when it retreats, it doesn't quite disappear. It waits, patient and familiar, like a forgotten suitcase tucked just out of sight. And Naomi could feel the weight of it now just overhead, in the compartments that hadn't yet been opened. Lena stood near the galley, her hands tightening reflexively around the edge of the counter. The low hum of the engines filled the space around her, but it couldn't quite drown out the sound of her own thoughts. Rebecca stood a few feet away, fastening a latch on one of the supply cabinets. Her movements were casual, practiced, but her eyes drifted toward Lena, taking quiet measure of the space between them. You're still thinking about her, Rebecca said finally. Lena glanced up, startled by the suddenness of the remark. I'm not, Lena replied too quickly, though the words felt brittle even as she said them. Rebecca smiled faintly, not unkindly. You know, there's something funny about people like you. Lena's brow furrowed. People like me? Rebecca's gaze was steady. The ones who don't think they have a problem. Lena shifted her weight, folding her arms across her chest. I didn't say I had a problem. Rebecca leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. You didn't have to. Lena looked away, her eyes fixed on the thin curtain separating them from the first-class cabin. She could feel Naomi's presence there, quiet, unmoving, like a stone in the center of a still pond. Lena started, but the sentence trailed off. She just sat there. Rebecca finished for her. Lena opened her mouth, ready to deny it, but the words didn't come. Instead, she felt the dull weight of recognition settling in her chest. She sat there like she belonged. Lena muttered. Rebecca's eyes softened. Because she does. Lena exhaled slowly, pressing her palms against the counter as if the cool metal might ground her. It's not that simple, Lena whispered. Rebecca studied her for a long moment. Isn't it? Naomi felt the shift in the air. The subtle change that came when the plane broke through the last layer of clouds and the ground came into view. She could hear the faint murmur of passengers waking, the rustle of blankets and the soft snap of tray tables locking into place. But even as the plane began to settle, Naomi remained still. Her seatbelt was already fastened, her belongings neatly packed away. It was a skill she had perfected over the years, the art of readiness, of keeping yourself composed long before the world required it. As the cabin lights brightened, Lena appeared once more, her hands folded in front of her. Ladies and gentlemen, Lena's voice came over the intercom, smooth and professional. We've begun our final descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Naomi glanced toward Lena as she passed. But this time, their eyes did not meet. Lena's gaze drifted elsewhere toward the overhead compartments, the emergency exits, anywhere but C2A. And Naomi understood. Some battles didn't end with words or apologies. Some ended with avoidance, with the quiet admission that there was nothing left to say. As the plane touched down, Naomi felt the soft lurch beneath her feet, the sudden, grounding reminder that she was back on familiar soil. The wheels rolled steadily along the runway, and Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. By the time the plane came to a full stop, the passengers in first class were already gathering their things, stretching and smoothing their clothes. Naomi remained seated, watching as the others filed out one by one. Lena stood near the exit, offering polite goodbyes as passengers passed her by. But when Naomi approached, Lena straightened, her smile thin but present. "Thank you for flying with us," Lena said, her voice careful, measured. Naomi paused, meeting her gaze for the briefest moment. "No," Naomi said quietly. "Thank you." Lena blinked, her expression unreadable, but Naomi could see the flicker of something beneath it, uncertainty, maybe even regret. Naomi stepped off the plane without another word. Some part of her suspected that Lena would remember this flight long after it had faded from Naomi's mind. And perhaps that was enough. Because sometimes, change didn't arrive in the form of grand gestures or loud reckonings. Sometimes, it arrived quietly in the spaces left behind, in the discomfort that lingered long after the descent was over. And Naomi could live with that. The airport terminal stretched wide and impersonal, a place where strangers slipped past one another like fleeting shadows. Naomi Carter walked with the ease of someone who knew how to move through spaces that weren't quite built for her. Her steps were deliberate, but not rushed. There was power in stillness, in refusing to be hurried, in allowing the world to adjust itself around you. The other passengers from first class dispersed quickly, melting into the broader crowd. But Naomi felt the weight of unspoken things trailing behind her like the faint scent of rain after a storm. She could still feel Lena Foster's gaze, lingering long after Naomi had left the plane. That was the thing about these moments, they didn't always end at the gate. They traveled. Naomi paused near the baggage claim, standing quietly as the carousel creaked to life. Around her, the hum of distant conversations filled the air. People hugged, laughed, checked their phones. But Naomi felt apart from it all, as if standing on the edge of a stage, just beyond the glow of the lights. She had lived with this feeling for so long that it no longer felt unfamiliar. It was simply the cost of moving through a world that saw you first and foremost as a question. Lena Foster stepped off the plane 20 minutes later, her shoulders tight beneath the weight of something she couldn't quite name. The terminal was quieter now, the rush of departing passengers having faded into the evening. Rebecca trailed behind her, tugging lightly at the collar of her uniform as they walked toward the crew lounge. "You're thinking about her," Rebecca said, not as a question but as a fact. Lena didn't bother denying it. Lena began, but the words seemed to dissolve before they could fully form. Rebecca slowed her pace, allowing Lena to catch up. "Let me guess," Rebecca said, "you're wondering if you should have handled things differently." Lena exhaled sharply. "Maybe." Rebecca's eyes softened, though the edge in her voice didn't fade. "It's not about what you did, Lena," Rebecca said. "It's about why you felt the need to do it in the first place." Lena stopped walking, turning slightly toward the glass windows overlooking the runway. "I thought I was being careful," Lena said, but even she could hear the hollowness in her own voice. Rebecca nodded slowly, stepping closer. "That's the problem," Rebecca said. "Being careful is just another way of keeping distance. And people like Naomi Carter, they notice." Lena looked down, the polished floor reflecting fragments of her own face. Distorted and uncertain, Naomi's bag rolled onto the carousel, the wheels gliding silently across the slick metal. She reached for it, but as her hand curled around the handle, she felt someone approaching. "Lena." Naomi didn't turn right away. She waited, allowing the distance between them to narrow until Lena stood just a few feet away. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Naomi finally straightened, her eyes meeting Lena's. "Ms. Carter," Lena began, her voice quieter than before. "I just wanted to say, if I came across the wrong way during the flight. That wasn't my intention." Naomi studied Lena carefully, the weight of her gaze measured but unmistakable. Lena shifted, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I thought I was doing my job," Lena continued, the words tumbling out faster now. "But I realize now that I might have been." "You were," Naomi interrupted softly, her voice cutting through the apology like glass. Lena's breath caught. Naomi's expression didn't harden, but it didn't soften either. "I've heard this before," Naomi said, her tone calm but firm. "Different words, different faces, but the story is always the same." Lena's shoulders sagged slightly. Naomi could see the discomfort settling in, the way Lena's eyes flickered toward the exit, as if seeking a way out of the moment. But Naomi didn't let her escape. "There's a difference between doing your job," Naomi said, "and making someone explain why they deserve to be here." Lena's eyes returned to Naomi's, and for the first time since the flight, she truly looked at her. Naomi didn't blink. "I paid for that seat, Lena," Naomi said, her voice unwavering. "And yet you needed something else, something I could never quite give you." Lena swallowed hard, the truth pressing down heavier than she had expected. "I didn't think," Lena started, but the words faltered. Naomi offered a faint, knowing smile. "That's the problem," Naomi said. "You didn't have to." The two women stood there for a moment, the carousel humming softly behind them, the space between them filled with all the things that had been left unsaid. Finally, Lena nodded. "I'm sorry," Lena said, and this time the words felt smaller, more honest. Naomi held her gaze for a second longer, then turned toward the exit without another word. She walked into the terminal, the wheels of her suitcase rolling behind her, the echo of Lena's apology trailing like a faint shadow. Some things wouldn't change overnight. But Naomi had learned long ago that change wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it started quietly like footsteps receding into the distance, leaving behind the weight of what had been. And as she moved forward, Naomi let the weight stay where it belonged. The city outside the airport was hushed beneath the weight of late evening. The kind of quiet that settled after too many conversations had been left unfinished. Naomi Carter moved through the automatic doors, stepping into the cool embrace of the night. The terminal lights stretched across the pavement, illuminating tired travelers and idle taxis. Yet Naomi felt alone, as though the air itself had widened the space around her. She had known, of course, that the encounter with Lena Foster would not dissolve the weight of things. Racism, after all, was not undone by apology. It was stubborn, like smoke caught in the walls long after the fire had died. But Naomi had accepted this long ago, not as resignation, but as recognition. Change rarely arrived as thunder. It crept in quietly, taking root in small, uneasy moments. And perhaps that was enough. Naomi tightened her grip on the suitcase handle, pulling it toward the curb. Her car was parked somewhere beyond the rows of street lamps. And as she walked, her footsteps echoed faintly in the stillness. The air smelled of asphalt and jet fuel, but Naomi carried with her the lingering scent of the plane, the recycled air, the faint tang of stale coffee, and beneath it all, the unspoken tension that had trailed her like a second shadow. Inside the airport, Lena Foster remained rooted near the baggage claim. Long after Naomi had disappeared through the glass doors, Rebecca stood beside her, watching the empty carousel circle lazily as if it, too, was waiting for something that would never arrive. "You stayed," Rebecca remarked softly, breaking the silence. Lena's arms tightened across her chest. "I thought I should." Rebecca offered a faint smile, though it carried little amusement. "You thought staying here might change what already happened?" Lena's eyes flickered toward the exit, her gaze distant. "I don't know." Rebecca's smile faded, replaced by something heavier, something Lena hadn't yet learned to name. "You were hoping for forgiveness," Rebecca said plainly, not unkindly. Lena's shoulders sagged under the weight of the words. "She didn't owe you that," Rebecca continued. Lena nodded, but the gesture felt hollow. "I know," Lena admitted, her voice quieter now, "but it doesn't sit right, letting it end like that." Rebecca sighed, leaning against the edge of the counter. "Lena, there's something you need to understand." Lena glanced at her. "Waiting. People like Naomi," Rebecca said, her voice steady but low. "They don't need you to make peace with it. They don't need you to feel bad. They need you to see it." "See what?" Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. "The way the world splits open when someone like her walks into a room. The way it tries to close around her, as if her presence alone disturbs the air." Lena looked down, her brow furrowing. "I wasn't trying to." "I know," Rebecca interrupted, "but the thing is, Lena, it doesn't matter what you were trying to do." Lena exhaled, rubbing the back of her neck. "So what am I supposed to do now?" Rebecca watched her for a long moment before speaking again. "You pay attention," she said simply, "and the next time the world starts closing in, you hold it open even if it's just by standing still." Lena didn't respond, but her silence held the weight of someone who had begun, however reluctantly, to listen. Naomi's car sat beneath a flickering streetlight at the edge of the parking lot. She loaded her suitcase into the trunk, her movements slow, unhurried. As she slid into the driver's seat, she caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror, the faint reflection of a woman both exhausted and unbroken. Naomi thought of Lena, of the apology left hanging in the terminal like a coat draped across the back of a chair, present, but never fully worn. She wondered if Lena understood yet. That the weight Lena felt tonight, the unease she carried, was the smallest fraction of what Naomi had shouldered her entire life. And Naomi knew she would carry it again. Because the truth was, some doors would always stick when she tried to walk through them. And sometimes, the people holding the keys would ask her to explain why she had knocked in the first place. But Naomi had learned not to wait for invitations that might never come. She drove forward, the headlights cutting through the dark, illuminating the narrow path ahead. Behind her, the airport shrank into the distance. But Naomi knew the story did not end there. The war was not over. It would wait for her in another airport, another boardroom, another quiet seat where the air shifted uncomfortably. But for now, Naomi pressed onward. The road stretched ahead, and she followed it not because the world had changed, but because she had no intention of stopping. The world felt different after encounters like these, not louder, but quieter. As Naomi Carter's car slipped through the empty streets, she thought of how racism, When polite, left no scars that could be pointed to, no wounds that bled visibly. It lived in the silences. And tonight, the silence pressed in from all sides, steady and suffocating. The streetlights above flickered like faint stars. But Naomi's focus remained on the road ahead. Her hands rested lightly on the wheel, her grip neither tense nor loose, but firm like someone who understood the necessity of control. She didn't need to replay the flight. The memory of it lingered, not as a sharp pang, but as a dull ache that stretched itself across her chest. Long and constant. Lena Foster's apology echoed in Naomi's mind, though not for the reasons Lena might have hoped. Because Naomi wasn't surprised by the apology. She wasn't even moved by it. She was tired of it. There was something exhausting about watching someone stumble over their own guilt while expecting grace in return. Naomi had granted that grace so many times before that it no longer felt like forgiveness. It felt like routine. And forgiveness, when routine begins to lose its shape. Naomi turned onto a narrow street lined with rows of brick buildings. In the darkness, they looked worn but steady, the kind of structures that had seemed too much to fall apart now. She wondered if she looked the same. Across the city, Lena Foster sat alone in her small apartment, the glow from a nearby lamp casting long shadows across the room. A half-empty glass of water rested on the table, and beside it, her uniform lay neatly folded, a relic of the day that now refused to leave her thoughts. Lena had replayed the moment at baggage claim more times than she cared to admit. Each time, Naomi's words returned sharper, clearer. I paid for that seat, Lena, and yet you needed something else, something I could never quite give you. Lena traced her finger along the rim of the glass, watching as the condensation pooled beneath it. She thought of Naomi's face, calm, unwavering. Lena hadn't known what she was looking for on that flight. Maybe it was reassurance. Maybe it was something closer to relief. But she hadn't found it. What Naomi had given her instead was the truth. And the truth, Lena realized, didn't come with comfort. It came with weight. Naomi's apartment was quiet when she entered. The faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound to greet her. She set her suitcase by the door, peeling off her coat with the slow movements of someone who had carried too much for too long. She stood for a moment in the dim light of the living room, staring out the window at the distant glow of the city. There had been a time when she believed things like this would pass, that people like Lena would learn, and the world would shift because of it. But Naomi had lived enough years to know that some shifts happened too slowly to notice. And some never happened at all. She walked toward the kitchen, setting a kettle on the stove with quiet precision. The small, simple ritual grounded her, as if by occupying herself with the ordinary, she could ward off the weight of the extraordinary. The kettle hissed softly, and Naomi leaned against the counter, her gaze fixed on the steam as it rose and disappeared. She thought again of Lena, how small she had looked beneath the fluorescent lights of the terminal. As if she, too, was carrying something she hadn't expected. Naomi exhaled, long and steady. She didn't doubt Lena's sincerity. But sincerity, Naomi knew, was not enough to undo the fabric of things. Lena's phone buzzed softly beside her on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Rebecca. Rebecca, I hope you're sitting with it. Lena frowned, reading the words twice, as if they might change with a second glance. She didn't reply, but as she placed the phone back down, she felt the weight of the message settle inside her. Because Rebecca wasn't talking about the flight. She was talking about the silence that followed. And Lena was beginning to understand that sometimes, silence wasn't absence, it was consequence. Naomi sat by the window, her cup of tea warm in her hands, watching as the first hints of morning began to stretch along the horizon. The city was waking, but Naomi remained still, because in moments like these, she understood that the world didn't need her to move. It needed her to hold the weight of the day, hold the silence that followed, and hold herself whole and steady until the world learned how to carry its own. The city had begun to stir, though the sun had only just broken the edge of the horizon. Naomi Carter sat by her window, the last sips of tea cooling in the cup beside her. The steam had long since disappeared, but the quiet remained, wrapping itself around the room like a familiar coat. In another hour, she would leave for the office. The emails would come, the meetings would fill the spaces between lunch and evening, and the memory of seat 2A would become one more thing tucked into the corners of her day. But not yet. For now, Naomi let herself sit in the weight of it. It was a weight she had carried before, a subtle thing, not sharp enough to pierce but heavy enough to pull at the seams of her patience. The flight with Lena Foster would not define Naomi's week, nor even her day, but Naomi understood something Lena did not. The encounter was not singular. It was not confined to a plane or a terminal. It stretched backward, touching the heels of Naomi's mother, her grandmother, and beyond them, the women who sat quietly in rooms they paid to occupy, yet still felt like intruders. Lena had asked nothing explicit of Naomi. There were no insults, no raised voices, but the asking, the needing had been there. Explain yourself. Prove you belong. It was not the loud kind of racism that made headlines. It was the quiet kind that slipped into boardrooms, classrooms, and yes, first-class cabins. The kind that left no bruises but drained you all the same. Lena Foster sat in her car outside the airport, the engine humming softly beneath her. Her shift had ended, and the lot had begun to empty. But she remained, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. She had spent the drive home replaying Naomi Carter's face. Not her words, though they had been few, but the look Naomi had given her. It was not anger. Lena almost wished it had been. Anger could be explained away. It could be labeled as overreaction, folded neatly into the back of Lena's mind and left to gather dust. But Naomi's gaze had been calm, measured. It had been the look of someone who had seen this play out too many times to be surprised. And that, Lena realized, was worse, because it meant Naomi had walked onto that plane expecting it. Lena shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The thing about racism, the kind Lena preferred to believe herself distant from, was that it didn't require hatred. It didn't demand cruelty. Sometimes, all it required was doubt. And Lena had doubted Naomi. Rebecca's words echoed in her mind. It's not about what you did. It's about why you felt the need to do it. Lena rested her head against the back of the seat, eyes fluttering shut for just a moment. She wondered if Naomi Carter was still thinking about the flight. She wondered if Naomi ever stopped thinking about moments like that. In her apartment, Naomi gathered her things slowly, her keys, her bag, before heading for the door. The day lay ahead, filled with all the ordinary tasks that made up the life she had built. But Naomi could not help but feel that something of herself had been left behind on that plane. Perhaps Lena felt it too. But Naomi knew that the burden of recognition did not rest equally on both their shoulders. Lena could forget. Naomi could not. And that, Naomi thought, was the difference. The door clicked shut behind her. But the echo of it remained. It always did.